So, good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here. I don't know if I need this, but so this evening I'm going to be doing part one of a two-part little seminar. So next week we'll hear what I think is kind of a continuation of this topic. So we'll continue with that next week. So to me, these are sets of foundational teachings of the Buddha. And the first one that we're going to talk about tonight is called the three Dharma seals. In some lineages, it's referred to as the three marks of existence. And next week, I'll continue with what I think is part of this set known as the three doors of liberation. So I want to say, first of all, that I hope that these fundamental teachings are an invitation for exploration rather than something to believe in. They're really there. The teachings, the sutras, the words, they're all tools for each of us to be able to study the self. Each of us has to discover those truths within our own set of conditions. And so these are, they're just offerings to kind of ponder and try out and see what you think of them. So I may stop for comments as we go along with some of the things I'm going to talk about. So before we delve into the main topic, I should say that I called this talk Uncovering the Three Dharma Seals. I forgot. And so before we delve into the main topic for this evening, though, I want to mention something called the two truths in Buddhism. And as we discuss the other topics, maybe this notion of the two truths will help inform the rest of what I'm talking about. So in Buddhist understanding, we live in two realms really simultaneously. And, they're not exactly two, but we're going to say they're two realms. The realm of the conditioned, that's our historic realm that we're used to living in. We go to the grocery store, we, drive the car. All those things are part of our conditioning, our conditioned historic realm, where we have a distinct boundary of a body and a life that we are carrying out. I remember some old Zen story about somebody that, was asking about or stating to the teacher that, no, I have no self or something. And the teacher grabbed his nose and said, well, who's pinching your nose then or something? Anyway, so, we can't discount that we have boundaries on a body and all those things. But there is another realm, and it's called the realm of the unconditioned. And it's some people, Thich Nhat Hanh, who is my root teacher, called it the ultimate realm, the ultimate dimension. And they're interrelated, and they're two sides of the same coin, and they're really never apart. There isn't a possible way that you can have one without the other. So in the Heart Sutra, we hear form is emptiness, and emptiness is form. And in the conditioned realm, there are many concepts and many constructs, and these are integrated into our sense of separateness and our self-identity. These may be coming from our thoughts, our perceptions, our constructs, and we use those things like traffic laws and rules at the library or whatever. So in the teachings of the Buddha, however, everything, all of these perceptions, all of these constructs also live in the realm of the unconditioned, the ultimate realm. And a common analogy that Thich Nhat Hanh used to always like to illustrate was talking about waves and the ocean. We are waves. We have an individual form, if you will, part of the time, and it's always changing, but we're never not the ocean. And so it's just a kind of, a way to think about things. So it's this understanding that allows us how to consider how, for a time, we do have our own lifespan. But truly, we're also always part of the ocean, ultimately free from coming and going, and from birth and death, which we'll talk about a little more. So, as I move into our discussion, I want to give some examples from my own life and perspective about living in both of these realms, and how sometimes we can be offered a glimpse that somehow may jolt us into seeing that we're really in both of these at the same time. So, these examples that I'm going to offer help me open the hand of thought, as a famous teacher said, Uchiyama Roshi said. And for those who don't know him, he was actually the teacher of another really famous living teacher, Shohaku Okumura. And he's a really well-known Dogen scholar. Anyway, these examples are not earth-shattering at all. They're just things that come to mind. They're just things that that somehow caught me into revealing this pattern of thought that perpetuates my mind and influences who I am. So I want to emphasize that I'm not trying so hard anymore to get rid of unwanted qualities. I'm just allowing myself to see more and more in an objective way. Aha, there I go again. I think the more we can objectively notice these characteristics, the more we are able to uncover them. So Uchiyama Roshi loves to remind us that there are often these often constant thoughts he calls brain secretions. And when we think of them in that way, it's kind of helpful because we sort of realize that they're human things, but they're not the ultimate truth. They're just stuff, that we're thinking. And I remember one time, some of you may know our teacher that founded Red Cedar, Norman Fisher. His wife is also a teacher. And she was talking about how one time she just decided to scribble down her thoughts, or just for a little bit, just to see how wise they were. And she said they were just like, this mumbo jumbo of things, one subject after another. And it's just really good to kind of be aware of that stuff that's just going on all the time, that's not necessarily the most wise and the most permanent. So, yeah. So anyway, it's kind of like this poem that I found the other day. It was actually, I think I read it in our 7 o'clock thing, but it was by an old Zen teacher, sure do. And it's just this little short thing that says, cloud of distress is just cloud of distress. Rain of sadness is just rain of sadness. Storm of anger is just storm of anger. Without being cleaned up, opening the hand of thought, just sit. As the boundless sky is the boundless sky, including the clouds. So we can kind of watch things kind of coming and going and not try to make them go away, but also just realize that, they're just constant. So when we examine Buddhist teachings, there are two realms. As always, both of those are always interrelated and illustrate understanding from a perspective or another. And if you are interested in reading sutras, you've maybe read, different sutras that that go back and forth with the explanations. So something really helpful to keep in mind, I know Thich Nhat Hanh was doing a commentary on the Lotus Sutra, and he illustrated how it's really good to see what perspective the narrator is coming from, because sometimes they're in the historical realm, And other times they're in the ultimate realm and they kind of go back and forth, and sometimes it's just really confusing. So it's just something to keep in mind, as you're reading through these sutras, that, where are they coming from? Are they talking about historic, realm, or the ultimate realm? So I'll talk about it. I'll talk about that more a little bit later. The reason that we want to uncover this ultimate realm little by little is because that's the place of freedom. That's the place that is unhindered, by the thoughts and going to the grocery store and figuring out what to buy and that kind of stuff. So we'll just kind of hold that. But they give us a chance to see beyond our identity that we've created, which is often very narrow and confining. And it also gives us a chance to transform the historical realm that often leads us to suffering. So tonight, when I look at these three Dharma seals, they really are seals. They're called seals because they're really kind of seals of authentication. And so it's said that if a teaching doesn't bear these three signs, I shouldn't say signs, these three seals, that it's not a teaching of the Buddha. And so there are things we can kind of think about and use to gauge, when we read something. Is that does that contain these three seals that we're going to talk about? So the first seal is impermanence, and the second seal is no self, which we'll talk about, and the third seal is nirvana. But in some schools of Buddhism, they say the third seal is suffering, and it's a little bit, some schools use one and some use another. So we'll talk about that a little bit more, why and how you can hold both of those. So impermanence is the first Dharma seal. If we look at this on a day-to-day, even moment-by-moment basis, we intellectually understand that that's true. And yet, I'm not sure if we're really getting this fully, or at least me. Sometimes we can catch ourselves betraying our understanding of this. And so, one of the fundamental verses from the Buddha, encouraged, they're very encouraged to repeat and think about, recollect every day. It's called the Five Remembrances. Does anybody know those? Ariel knows, Ken knows, yeah, Echo. So a lot of people I know practice with this every day, and these five remembrances are talking about our conditioned world. And they say, I am a nature to grow old. There is no way to escape growing old. I'm a nature to have ill health. There is no way to escape having ill health. I am of a nature to die. There is no way to escape death. All that is dear to me and everyone I love are of a nature to change. There is no way to escape being separated from them. My actions are my only true belongings. I cannot escape the consequences of my actions. My actions are the ground on which I stand. So when we first encounter this verse, we may feel kind of repelled by it. It sounds so glum and pessimistic. So we think, why is this helpful to hear? I just wondered if you have any comment about that as we go along. What your first impression was, or why you think maybe they're helpful.
Helpful to hear, possibly because without reciting that in a day, maybe we'll spend our day trying to chase those,
Right.
the exit of death, or
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. John?
Yeah, I remember the first time I read that, it was a little bit shocking, but then I felt a real relief.
Mm.
My stomach relaxed because it's true.
Yeah,
Even if
right,
it's a dark truth, if it's true,
right.
there's some comfort in seeing, they're not trying to hide it. They're not trying
Yeah,
to.
right,
I
right.
remember that very strongly.
Yeah,
Reaction.
yeah, thanks. Yeah, so when we encounter this, Thich Nhat Hanh says the five remembrances help us make friends with our fears about growing old, about getting sick, about being abandoned and dying, and maybe about our craving and attachment, to things, as you were talking about. They really can be a mindfulness bell to help us appreciate the wonders of life right now available. Um, but then Thich Nhat Hanh says, well, then why would Avalokiteshvara in the Heart Sutra say there is no birth and death? Why would the Buddha say that we are of a nature to die if there is no birth and death? Because the five remembrances, the Buddha is using the tool of the relative truth, the conditioned world. It's reality, it is the truth in this world, that we're living in. But he's also aware of this deeper truth, this absolute truth, the ultimate reality, where there is no birth and death, which we'll talk about as we go along. So I think the more I recite this, the more it helps me also touch that ultimate reality, the reality that is deeper than birth and death, coming and going, you and me. But first, I think we have to recognize and accept the reality of the conditioned world. It's kind of like, I don't know, thinking about suffering, we can't really go around it, and so this is kind of like that. We need to be able to see how things are right now. We need to see that this body is not going to go on living forever. So we, as humans, habitually deepen and deepen our brain's neural pathways, creating what we like to think of as our identity, continuing forever. And Uchiyama Roshi says these tools, to practice with, they give us different pathways. And I was listening to another Dharma talk too, that he was talking about all these ways we we have such deep neural pathways, again and again and again, that when we have those so established, that's when we have no beginner's mind with that anymore. We skip over it and just think, oh, yeah, I know that. If it's an apple, if it's whatever it is, we don't even really see it. And so some of these tools that the Buddha offered are really tools to help develop different pathways, as we practice, like again and again. So here's an example of, here's a couple kind of silly examples of me figuring, me really believing in permanence and liking to live there, and really just being a little shocked when I found out that I really was doing that. So the first one, I remember, we moved quite a bit back. We've moved several times, and this time where we are now, when we moved in, there was this great big huge hedge of blackberries. And the neighbors, offered, oh, I've got some poison if you want to get rid of those, or they wanted us to cut them out. And oh, am I still standing? Okay, I think I touched that. So anyway, I felt very protective of the blackberries as soon as we moved in, because the birds especially love them. They love that hedge, and it's their refuge. And and it just made me want to really, protect them. So we're really good at keeping them cut down, so the neighbors aren't too mad. But anyway, we started thinking about moving at one time, and I thought, oh, I can't move. I have to protect these. I have to protect the hedge and the birds. And no, I don't want to have that, go away. And then all of a sudden, I realized that I was not going to be around forever. I couldn't, no matter how long I stayed in the house, it would come to an end. I couldn't be there to protect them all the time. And then, the hedges aren't going to be there forever either. So it was just kind of like this, wait a minute, how long did I think that I was going to be able to, protect them all? So another thing that was really, you know, kind of just, well, I'll just tell you the story. My dad, before he died, a couple years before he died, we went to the store. He wanted to get some um, clothes, including underwear. And so, he figured out, okay, he wanted this kind of underwear, and he grabbed it and put it in the cart. And right away, I grabbed a second package. And I said, oh, here, Dad, just throw these in. You might as well get those while we're here. And he turned around and he said, honey, how long do you think I'm going to be around? And it just made me realize, that I hadn't even thought of that, and he had. He was really practical. He knew that ahead. And so, anyway, it's things like that, I think sometimes that we encounter that we have a little realization, but, that my thoughts just want me to continue forever, or whatever. But anyway, so I think our minds betray us. We can be, we can intellectually tell ourselves, yes, yes, I know things are impermanent, but when it comes right down to it, our misperceptions come to the surface. So what can we do about this? Just have awareness, just have a recollection. I think it's both awareness in the moment and also a recollection of some of these stories or whatever that happened to us that we think, oh, yeah. So the next Dharma seal is called no self. So what does this mean? Does it mean that I am nothing ultimately? Does it mean that I'm not a person living in this world? As we talk about emptiness next week, also, we'll talk a little bit further about what we are made of and how this is in addition to or beyond who we think we are. So, think we are. Think is a big clue. Our identity has been carved out again and again, mostly by our mind. So, Thich Nhat Hanh says that often Tai says that we are made of non-self elements, and when we talk about emptiness, we'll talk about that a little bit more. Um, but in fact, there is no identity that we can find um, that is who we think we are. So myself, Desiree, is made of all non-self elements and bits and pieces of really all of existence. We know scientifically that we're calcium and iron, and we came from the stars, and all of these things that actually are pretty wonderful. But it's not a question of whether I exist or not. It's a recognition of all these things that came together for me to appear, for my manifestation to appear. And it doesn't take long to see how how my mother and father are in me, and how their karma and their actions are also in me. And it's sometimes very clear to think, oh, okay, that was from my dad, or but I think um, I want to talk about it a little more. This subject is really the same to me as emptiness, which we're going to talk about next week. So we'll kind of investigate this a little bit more. Um, but sometimes I'm shocked again about things that don't fit who I think that I am. Sometimes just some fleeting things. So, for instance, have you ever been to the dentist and had your x-rays taken, and then they show you this skull with with these teeth, and you think, "Oh my gosh, is that me?" And it's just kind of it doesn't fit, with our perception of me. And I think all of those things are really good for us, actually. So anyway, so that's a little one. But I had a jolt like that one time, that really pulled me out of my me identity, and shocked me in different ways, in terms of who I thought me was. But it happened quite a few years ago now. Um, we got a microscope from my son, and he was probably, I don't know, 8 or 9 or something. And so I wanted to show him these discoveries, on the slide. So first I went out to the planter outside, and I got this little vial of stagnant water. And I put it on the slide, and we looked in there, and there were all these little, creatures, all these little bacteria and all these whatever living creatures in there. And the first thing, that I felt was like this compassion for all of these little living things. And I realized, that I don't usually think of them, I don't usually acknowledge them because I'm not usually looking at them. But I saw them, and as soon as I saw them, then I thought, my thought was, oh, I want to take care of them and be careful not to harm them and put them back into the planter when we're done, you know. So then I decided to show my son some red blood cells from my body living there. I felt like renting space from me. And so I pricked my finger and I put a drop of blood on the slide. And we saw these little organisms, these little red blood cells. It was really kind of like astonishing. We looked at the slide and they were vibrating, they were alive, just for a few seconds. And then they just slowly stopped moving. And, it was such a weird thing, because then I realized that the red blood cells were me. And just for a few seconds, they were alive, and no border, at least on the inside, no border separated them from me. But secondly, I saw that I had a strange notion about gathering them. I had more compassion for the creatures on the slide from the planter, I felt like, than I did for me. It was, I just had this thing like, oh, that was just me. And so that was also kind of like a strange juxtaposition, I thought. Um, yeah, it was just like seeing them separate at first, but then understanding that they were me, and some kind of judgment, about, oh, that's just my blood. And it reminds me of Dogen's Genjo Koan, where he was talking about all the things that live in their own environment, the birds flying in the sky, in the air, the fish in the water. And if the bird leaves that environment, it dies at once. And if the fish leaves the water, did I say that wrong? Then they die at once. And it was. I thought, oh, and my red blood cells, if we take them out of their environment, they die too. But it made me. I saw that everything, is really living and dying at the same time, each in its own element, and all of these pieces are me. I truly have no separate identity, and neither do the red blood cells or the vast network of sentient and non sentient beings that make up me. And somehow I had a deeper appreciation for these cells that were living as individual cells, and at the time, also interconnected within this larger structure, that was me. So I think it's like that with everything. We have a separate self that gets up and makes breakfast and goes about the day, and yet we really have no true boundaries if we're looking deeply at everything that made us up. It's true, that the elements are living and dying continuously, every moment, impermanence, making room for new manifestations, both within this body and without. Being alive and then not alive is happening all the time to all sentient beings, from single cells to human beings, ever arising, ever passing away. But if we touch the ground of being, our ultimate nature, still right here, nothing is really lost. And I think I'll talk about that more next week. So before I continue to the next topic, does anybody want to share an experience, kind of a similar thing that sort of jolted them out of their identity, Ariel? Mm. Yeah. Mm. 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 Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Thanks. Mm. 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 Yeah. Mm. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah. Back here.
Yeah, for me personally, I was just thinking I've had several like identities as a kid. My
Mm.
identity was different than it is now as a teen,
Right.
in my 20s. And like right now, I feel there's I don't know how to explain it, but it's like the identity that here was here for a purpose for a long time.
Mm.
It's not serving a purpose anymore. I have trauma and anxiety, stuff
Mm.
like that, and I'm okay right now. I'm safe. Times are different, so like
Mm.
I think I'm at a forefront where it's like I'm changing, but I'm so used to that identity that I'm afraid
Mm.
to change it. It's protected me for so long. I'm afraid to change it.
Yeah.
And it's like when you're talking about water, it's like I've been trying to be a solid thing or one thing, but I'm liquid, and I'm trying to be like a solid.
Mm. Mhm. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah.
I just think the microscope is a very apt thing to talk about because for me, a lot of Buddhist concepts that are hard to grasp, it's
Mm.
a little bit like if if you turn, if you start, if you either step way, 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 way far back and look at it from the 8 million mile view, or if
Right.
you go really, really, really in, all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, because it's like, I mean, I read over the years, I've
Yeah.
read that every single molecule in your body is replaced in a 7 year by 7 years.
Yeah.
So I've been here for 63 years. So that means, I mean, I don't know how many sevens going to 63 because my math isn't that good. But there's a lot of different ones than me during that time period. It's a little bit like but you have to zoom way far in, like electron
Yeah.
microscope level to like, okay, my bones aren't the same bones that I had 7 years ago.
Yeah.
You know, it's just
Right.
like everything is changing and everything, and when you do that, you realize that you actually even in the the conditioned world, you're way more permeable than you think you are.
Yes. And way less permanent,
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
I really like that idea that everything in me, outside of me, everything is living and dying. All these things are living and dying all the time.
Well, I also
Yeah.
think that the
Yeah.
impermanence and the non-self, it's sort of the
Mm.
same concept. It's just
Mhm.
one's going this way and the
Yep.
other's going that way,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's the same idea, just
Kind of time and
two different
space.
two different dimensions.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. So, yeah. So finally, this evening, I want to talk about the third Dharma seal, sometimes the third and fourth, depending on where you are practicing. And the this Dharma seal is either called nirvana, or in some schools, it is suffering. And as we talk a little bit more, we'll see that really they're kind of two sides of the same coin. But well, I won't go on, so I'll just continue. Um, so the first Dharma seals that we talked about, impermanence and no self, are universal. They're marks of things in the conditioned world, and they are on the same level as each other. But Thich Nhat Hanh explains, to put suffering on that same level is an error because, in this conditioned world, it's not difficult to see, for instance, the table or the tree, in the forest or all of those things. It doesn't have a separate self. And in fact, it is constantly changing and all these new forms are growing out of it. And you can look at the tree and or the table and see the tree and see the woodcutter that was in there and see the rain and see the sun. So it really, it's easy to see that it has no self in that way, no separate self. Um, but is it suffering? He asks. It's part of this world, but it's not necessarily suffering. So suffering, Tai explains, suffering is not a given. It's not necessarily constant. Nirvana is its companion, the other side of the coin. And Tai explains nirvana to mean, he says that it's an extinction. And you ask, extinction of what? And it's extinction of notions and ideas. And so when we talk about nirvana, that doesn't mean some faraway, place in heaven or something that's perfect. It means um, that there aren't ideas, that notions and ideas in nirvana, in that freedom, that place. So we often cause, or most all the time, we cause our own suffering. And when we're in a place, when we place a permanent attribute onto something and are then attached to it, the Buddha, taught um, impermanence and no self so that we wouldn't get caught up in those kind of signs, which we'll talk about next week more. But from a worldly point of view, there is the suffering of impermanence and no self. But from the point of view of true nature, of the ultimate dimension, concepts are silenced and at peace. So nirvana is an underlying reality that's often obscured by suffering. And there's a note there that in the Southern transmission, the three Dharma seals are often said to be impermanence, suffering, and no self. But in the Samyukta Agama, the Buddha taught impermanence, no self, and nirvana as the three Dharma seals. And in the introduction commentary by Shohaku Okamura about a book by Dogen called Zui Monki, he discusses four Dharma seals and says that it includes suffering and nirvana like in their own category. But these states, he says, he sees that these are not really four separate items, but rather one unified message from the Buddha. He says, impermanence and no self are the true reality of all things. When we're blind to these truths and live based on the ideas of permanence and a fixed independent self, everything in our lives becomes suffering. However, when we awaken to the true reality instead, our life becomes nirvana. So I liked that statement. You know, they're just two sides of the same coin. So whichever version you like, whichever version you resonate with, you know, that's great. And the exploration comes back really to the Four Noble Truths: suffering, the causes of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the path. You know, so it's all really connected. So the more I practice, the more I see that my mind, my thoughts are truly the cause of much of my suffering, probably all of my suffering. Suffering is not the same as having pain or having physical discomfort. I can have pain in my leg, for instance, which I had a lot of, especially when I was younger. Yeah, okay, that was pain. But then I start ruminating about things with my mind, such as, oh no, why today? Why today of all days? I really wanted to go out with my friends on the outing. Why does this always happen to me? I couldn't, you know, and it goes on and on and on. Yeah. So that becomes the suffering. So emotional suffering makes up a huge amount of our suffering. I think I can add on a huge amount of fretting over something that is so often not even the truth. Here's another silly example. Parents can relate to this. A few years ago, when my son was still at home, he was out late and I started worrying. You know, once you start. So I woke up and he wasn't home and it was getting late, later and later, you know, and then I started worrying more and my mind was going round and round, and I think I texted him once or twice, no reply. So, you know, I was getting more and more frantic. And I texted him again, and this time I got a reply, and he said, "Mom, I'm home. I was asleep in bed." I was being so quiet so I wouldn't disturb you. Anyway, so he never lets me forget that. And I'm not saying that something couldn't have happened. You know, things happen, but it doesn't help to fret and worry about stuff. I mean, and I'm telling all of you as if I don't do that, but of course I do, you know, but yeah, all of those, you know, your mind can just take off. Yeah. So that energy, that kind of energy, not just fretting, but just energy where you're ruminating and, you know, you're not with what is. You're not with the way things are. It uses a lot of energy. And I've really noticed that, and sometimes um I can think about something, I can start like clinging to it or be attached to it, and it's a lot of energy. And if I can tell myself even just to let it go for 1 second, I really physically, can feel free. Just for that little bit there, anyway. So we spend a lot of time in emotional responses from these thoughts that are often not based on what's happening. We make decisions, about other people based on our assumptions, and our misperceptions lead us to fear and to insecurity, to anger. I think you've probably all heard the Zen story about the fisherman that was out on the water in the fog, and he saw this other fishing boat, and he at first couldn't, see it too well, but it was coming closer and closer and closer, and he was like, thinking, surely this person is going to see me at some point and stop, and but no, the boat just kept coming and coming. And so then he started getting more and more angry and agitated. What is he doing? Why is he not seeing me? And finally the boat just like slammed into him, and he was so angry, and he looked in the boat and no one was there. And I think that happens, so often, whether it's not exactly like that, but we can rile ourselves up so much with a perception that we think is true and correct, and it's not at all. We find, so often, that things are not the way they seem. So the Buddha taught us not to be fooled by what we perceive. He told Subhuti, where there is perception, there is deception. And a useful phrase for me from Thich Nhat Hanh is, are you sure? And I didn't like that phrase at first. I didn't like all the things that kind of hit home. I noticed. Like one time, this book that he wrote, it was called Anger. And my first thought is, oh, no, that's not for me. Put it aside, And all those things, even words, I think I talked about before, certain words that I didn't like, because I didn't really want to look at them. But this was one of the phrases, are you sure? And lately I'm using it a lot, because so often, when I really honestly think that, I think, oh, maybe not. So often, it happens that I see that I wasn't right or sure. So, sometimes people think of being in the world of suffering or being in the world of nirvana for a lifetime. But whether you question or wonder about reincarnation from lifetime to lifetime, we, as we've talked about a little bit, even in our own bodies, we mentioned, living and dying are happening all the time. And suffering and nirvana are present also. When I think about being in the realm of suffering, I see that this can be transformed in a moment, and vice versa. I found myself in a realm of suffering, or what I would call a realm of hell, in an instant, by my own actions. And so, I think heaven and hell are not reserved for the end of a lifetime or the beginning of another one. They are in the present moment. And it's possible to be in a realm of hell right now, and it's also possible, to be in a realm of nirvana right now. So it really, our thoughts and actions really determine where we're at. So, um, letting go of my ideas and notions and my incorrect perceptions, I can step into a realm of freedom. So, of course, for me, I just feel like it's just a constant back and forth. And watching how my mind works, I can really kind of have a little bit more choice on where I want to go. I think or where I want to be. I think Chris the other day had a question. Where do you abide? Like right now, where are you abiding? And I think that's a great question to really think about as we're going through the day. So next week, we'll talk a little bit more about our mind and perceptions and labels and signs and all of these things that can kind of trap us a little bit more or let us um, be free. So I want to bring up one last quote by Thich Nhat Hanh. He says that suffering is not a basic element of existence. It's a feeling. When we insist on something that is impermanent and without a self being permanent and having a self, we suffer, which we talked about. We can really pay attention to this phrase in our life and from a deep standpoint perhaps see more and more into this truth. We're often resisting something that is or wanting it to be different. The Buddha taught that when suffering is present, we have to identify it and then we can take steps to transform it. He did not teach us that suffering is a given, always. Thich Nhat Hanh continues, we practice the 3 Dharma seals to realize liberation. If you memorize a 5,000-page book on the 3 Dharma seals, but do not apply it to the teachings, do not apply those teachings during your daily life, the book will be of no use. Only by using intelligence and putting the teachings into practice can they bring you happiness. So please bring your practice into your own life and into your own experiences. The Buddha's teachings are jewels, but we have to dig deeper in order to touch them fully. So thank you for listening to the talk. And this evening, I think, oh my gosh, it's time. That's the first time I've ever gone over. Okay, so anyway, may our